Hello, class, and welcome to this class in counseling of families. This week we're going to be exploring the psychology of codependency. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I am your instructor for this course. Now, I want you to think about a time when you wanted to be supportive of someone that was close to you. Maybe it was a friend, maybe it was a family member, or maybe even a romantic partner. And they were going through a challenging situation. And I want you to reflect on how your desire to support them may have influenced your actions and decisions in the relationship. And I want you to think slowly about this. And I want you to consider whether your attempts to help ended up being beneficial or detrimental to both you and the other person involved. And in doing so, I want you to consider a few things. How did you define support in that situation? What kind of behaviors or actions did you engage in to show your support? And did you notice any patterns of behavior in yourself or the other person that may have contributed to the dynamics of the relationship? So I want you to look back and think about your efforts to be supportive. Were they effective in addressing the underlying issues? Or were you there simply to quote-unquote fix and save and shield the person from the consequences of their own actions? Now, of course, we want to care for people and help them. But sometimes we do it out of our own need and not out of the need of the person per se. Maybe what the person needs sometimes is a little bit different. So in this class, we're going to help you to understand codependency and to recognize your own needs and the needs of the other person, and how sometimes those two can get confused and intermeshed. So in today's class, we're going to start off with a little story about an important person. Then we're going to dive into a number of main themes. The first main theme is the whole idea of codependency. So we'll explore a little bit of how we define that and how there are many manifestations of codependency. We'll examine the personality traits, the characteristics and patterns of behavior commonly observed in codependent individuals. And then we'll look at the enabling behaviors that go into codependency. We'll define them. We'll look at some examples of them. And we'll explore a little bit of the underlying motivations behind these enabling actions. Then we'll take a look at how this intersects with substance use and look at why codependency and enabling behaviors intersect so strongly with substance use disorders. And we'll explore a little bit of the dynamics of relationships between codependent individuals and those struggling with substance abuse. And finally, we'll look at family systems and the role of family systems in perpetuating codependency and all of this enabling behavior, including the transmission of these patterns across generations and the impact on children and adolescents within codependent families. Because that is, of course, a very important part of counseling within families, is how can we stop some of these cycles so that we can be better ancestors for our great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, where these cycles of codependency and enabling behavior and substance use are no longer present. I want to introduce you to a lady by the name of Melody Beattie. She's born as Melody Anderson in 1948 in St. Paul, Minnesota. And she is a widely appreciated author, therapist, and a real pioneer in codependency and addiction recovery. Her life's work has been to understand and address all of the dynamics of codependent relationships, particularly in the context of substance use disorders. And she's really been a bit of a pioneer in the whole self-help literature and recovery movement. She herself has a personal journey that's marked by struggles with codependency and addiction, and that has provided her with some profound understandings of just how complex relationships are. She experienced a deeply committed relationship that had many challenges in it, and she struggled to find her own healing. Back in the 1980s, Beattie wrote a work called Codependent No More: How to Stop Controlling Others and Start Caring for Yourself. And this is a real groundbreaking work at the time because it really shed some light upon codependency and all of the psychological mechanisms that go into this cycle. And also she provides some practical strategies for individuals seeking to break free from the codependent patterns. So she really emphasizes the importance of self-awareness in working with addictions. That there needs to be awareness of yourself. Why are you doing what you're doing? There needs to be some boundary setting. That is, there needs to be, this is me and this is what I need to take care of, and that is you and that is what you need to take care of. And self-care, which is obviously an essential component in the recovery process, both for the person struggling with addiction, but also for those being impacted by the addiction. And her writing is known for being very compassionate. In addition to Codependent No More, she wrote a work called The Language of Letting Go and Beyond Codependency, works that really hint at the whole idea of sometimes not trying to fix everything, of sometimes recognizing that my first responsibility is to care for myself and not destroy my own life in order to try to quote-unquote fix you. And that is part of the whole importance of the boundary setting that is important to break the cycle of codependency. She does lots of lectures and workshops and seminars, or did at least, and was very well known for all of this, and really left a huge impact in the field of psychology. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, in that wake shortly after the pandemic, she passed away. But she did leave a legacy of compassion and of wisdom and of hope for those navigating the complexities of codependency and addiction. Now, I want to kind of go on and just introduce you a little bit to our exploration of the psychology of codependence and the enabling behavior, and just kind of try to define this a little bit, because codependency really refers to a psychological condition or what we could say a pattern of behavior where individuals prioritize the needs and emotions and well-being of the other at the expense of their own. So I want you to kind of just remember this. You're forgetting about taking care of yourself and just immersing yourself in trying to fix the other person. And this often involves our own need to be approved, to be validated, to have control within the relationship, maybe sometimes to be the hero in the relationship. The problem is this leads to a lot of hurt in yourself because you're inevitably going to be disappointed. It leads to a cycle of dependency and unhealthy attachment dynamics in the relationship. So here's an example of codependency. Just imagine a situation where an individual consistently prioritizes the needs and well-being of a loved one that's struggling with substance abuse over their own needs. and their own financial well-being. Despite experiencing emotional distress and neglecting personal boundaries, this individual remains deeply invested in controlling or fixing the loved one's addiction. And their sense of self-worth really becomes intertwined with their ability to manage the situation. The problem is, it's the kind of thing that you don't have a lot of control over. But this reflects the codependent dynamic within the relationship. And therein lies the problem. I also want to define a little bit of what we mean by enabling behavior, because enabling behaviors are actions or behaviors that are inadvertently support the maladaptive behavior. They perpetuate the problem, although we're trying to fix the problem, particularly in the context of substance use disorders. Enablers will often shield an individual from the consequences of their actions. They'll make excuses for the person. They'll call their job and say, hey, really they're home not feeling well. That sort of thing. Thereby enabling continued substance abuse and preventing them from confronting the reality of their behavior. Now, here's a beautiful saying that I've heard therapists say. Part of my job, and this is in the context of helping families deal with someone that's struggling with an addiction problem, is to help that person have a problem. Because the problem is the problem. But if they don't see that they have a problem, then we can help them see that they have a problem. Because, if someone is drinking all day, staying out all night, missing their work, that's a great life for them. Someone else is paying the bills, someone else is taking care of them, someone else is feeding them, someone else is making excuses for them. They don't have a problem. The person that has the problem in that situation is the codependent person. So sometimes what you need to do is to help the person with the substance abuse problem to actually have a problem, to have to face some of the consequences of that kind of addictive behavior in order to help them. Now, not in a way to harm them, but in a way to motivate them to want to do something better. It's all about motivation and self-care as well. So I want you to consider a scenario like this. This would be when I'm talking about enabling behavior here. When someone repeatedly covers up or excuses the actions of a family member or a friend who struggles with substance abuse. They may clean up after them. They may make apologies for their behavior to others. They may shield them from facing the consequences of their actions. And despite their good intentions, these actions inadvertently facilitate the continuation of the loved one's addiction by preventing them from experiencing the full impact of their behavior and seeking the necessary help. Now, let's look at some of the personality and characteristic traits of someone that lives in codependency. Because codependency is characterized by a range of personality traits and a number of behavioral patterns that really contribute to the maintenance of the dysfunctional relationship, particularly in the context of substance use disorders. So here are some key characteristics that are really common to people with codependent behaviors. First off would be excessive caretaking. So here is when you have a codependent individual that takes on that role of caregiver. They feel responsible for meeting the needs and solving the problems of others, even at the expense of their own well-being. They burn themselves out taking care of everybody else. Along with that comes low self-esteem. Codependent individuals frequently will struggle with feelings of inadequacy, insecurity, and a lack of self-worth. And that this may stem from childhood experiences or past traumas. But what it does is clinging on to this relationship even when it is destructive and unhealthy and is harming them. There's a lot of people pleasing. Codependent individuals tend to prioritize the needs and desires of the other over their own. They tend to find all of their validation and to seek approval through this relationship. And because of that, they're willing to sacrifice almost anything within themselves, their own dignity, their own happiness within the process. And of course, tied in with this also is difficulty in setting boundaries. Because a codependent person often struggles to establish and maintain healthy boundaries. They forget that there's a skin. We have skin for a reason. It separates from what is me, from what is you. So if you don't know where I end and you begin, there can't be healthy boundaries. And this leads to a pattern of over-involvement, emotional enmeshment. When the other person feels bad, you feel bad. And you allow yourself to be blown around emotionally by the other person. And they have difficulty asserting their own needs and preferences. Along with that is a fear of abandonment. Codependent individuals harbor deep-seated fears of rejection, of abandonment or loss. And this drives them to cling to relationships even when they are unhealthy or detrimental to their own well-being. Sometimes there's control issues. Someone with codependency may have controlling behaviors. It's kind of an anxiety thing. They need to control everything around them. And the idea here is that there's an effort to manage or manipulate the surroundings or the relationships. And this often stems from a desire to avoid the perceived chaos or the conflict. And sometimes it's important to just be peaceful within your own skin and not try to control everything else. And of course, there's denial and avoidance. A problem persists because we trick ourselves into thinking there isn't a problem or that we're fixing the problem. But we sometimes miss that the problem is codependency. We think it's just the substance abuse, but codependency can be a destructive problem too. So codependent individuals may deny or minimize the severity of the problem. Maybe it's the violence, maybe it's the substance abuse, but maybe it's the codependency. There are problems in the relationship. They rationalize, they justify, they make excuses for the unhealthy dynamics and they do these things as a means of coping with the underlying feelings of shame and guilt or inadequacy. We lie to ourselves, in essence, to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. But that's an inauthentic way of existing. And eventually it leads to neuroticism. It leads to a disconnect within ourselves. Being honest with ourselves is important. Authenticity is central in having a quality of life. Now, let's look a little bit at some of the factors that contribute to codependency. Because codependency often develops as a result of a lot of complex psychological and developmental factors that shape how a person learns relationship patterns and coping mechanisms. One of those patterns is their family of origin and the dynamics within the family of origin. because the family environment that you come from plays a crucial role in shaping how you understand relationships, how you understand what it means to be attached to someone else. So children raised in dysfunctional families characterized by substance abuse and neglect and emotional instability or trauma are more likely to develop codependent tendencies as they learn to adapt to chaotic and unpredictable environments. Having a calm, relaxed, engaged family dynamic that has structure to it is what we should be working for. But oftentimes we don't grow up with that, and so we don't know that it's a priority and we just ignore it. The whole idea of attachment theory, that we have different attachment styles that we establish in early childhood, and this kind of sets the pattern for our lives. It really significantly influences how we form and maintain relationships throughout our lives. And codependent individuals often exhibit very anxious or ambivalent attachment styles, and this is characterized by, this deep-seated feeling of abandonment or a heightened need for reassurance and closeness. So it's either, oftentimes, just like, I will do anything, just don't leave me behind. It's that kind of voice that's going on in them. And when that is there, you really need to be mindful of reworking the type of attachment that the person has so that they can develop secure attachments, stable attachments, attachments that aren't fear-based. Then there's modeling and social learning. We grow up watching others, and we internalize the behaviors of our caregivers and our role models. So when you grow up in a family where codependency is prevalent, a child will learn to prioritize other people's needs over their own and adopt these maladaptive coping strategies. They'll perpetuate the cycle of codependency across generations. The idea of traumatic experiences. Trauma, such as physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, can profoundly impact an individual's sense of self-worth, their safety and trust in relationships. Survivors of trauma may develop codependent behaviors as a means of coping with unresolved pain and fear and shame, seeking validation and security through their interactions with others. And then there's cultural and societal influences, because there are cultural norms and societal expectations that surround gender roles. And sometimes we just accept those without really evaluating. We accept that our culture says there are certain things that we must do as caregivers or in interpersonal relationships. But the problem is that these, if we just accept them without questioning them, without evaluating them, they can develop into and contribute to codependency. So in cultures that prioritize, for example, self-sacrifice and emotional caregiving and deference to authority figures, individuals may internalize beliefs and behaviors that really go to reinforcing these codependent patterns. So understanding the psychological and developmental roots of codependency is really essential for effective intervention and treatment. And by addressing underlying emotional wounds and challenging distorted beliefs about relationships and learning healthy coping strategies, individuals can begin to break free from the cycle of codependency and cultivate more fulfilling, balanced relationships. Now, I want to take a look at the dynamics of codependent relationships, because there's a lot of psychological dynamics that shape the interactions between individuals. Oftentimes, They revolve around themes of dependency or emotional entanglement or control. So I want to kind of look at some of these things. So when we think in terms of dependency and neediness in a codependent relationship, it's really marked by a disproportionate level of dependency, where one individual relies heavily on the other for their emotional validation, their emotional stability, their overall emotional fulfillment. And this dependency can create a sense of entrapment and obligation, perpetuating a cycle of emotional reliance and insecurity. So in some ways, it's healthy to be able to say, yeah, no, I'll survive without you. Because maybe we have to. Also, there's unequal power dynamics. Codependent relationships often feature imbalanced power dynamics, where one partner assumes a dominant or controlling role where the other adopts a submissive or compliant stance. And this imbalance of power may manifest in various forms, including manipulation, coercion, and emotional blackmail, further exacerbating feelings of dependency and helplessness. There's emotional fusion and enmeshment, where a person that is stuck in this codependent relationship may struggle to maintain healthy boundaries. They can't separate their own thoughts and their own feelings and identities from those of their partner. And this lack of differentiation can lead to emotional fusion and enmeshment. And what that means is a person really doesn't know who they are except with the other individual, where individuals become overly invested in each other's lives, and so they struggle to assert their autonomy and independence. You're not a real person if you consider the other person to be your other half in a deep, profound way. Now, it might sound very romantic, but that person isn't really our other half. They are a separate person. We can be with them, but to be enmeshed and fused is really unhealthy. Then there's cycles of conflict and reconciliation. And codependent relationships often follow a very predictable pattern of conflict and reconciliation. There's fighting and there's making up. And that's characterized by periods of intense emotional turmoil, followed by brief moments of harmony and connection. And these cycles of conflict and reconciliation serve to perpetuate the relationship dynamic. They reinforce feelings of attachment and dependency while masking underlying issues and unresolved conflicts. And finally, there's emotional regulation and codependency. In codependent relationships, individuals may rely on their partner's emotional state to regulate their own feelings and sense of self-worth. And this codependency can create a volatile emotional climate characterized by intense highs and profound lows, as individuals will oscillate between seeking validation and reassurance from the partner and then experiencing feelings of inadequacy and rejection from their partner. It becomes really emotionally exhausting if you've ever been within one. So it's important, I think, that we as counselors not only understand this psychological and relational dynamics in codependent relationships, but know how to help others parse through these things, to help identify them, to explore these issues in the counseling session, and to work through and recognize how we can deal better with these things, to avoid these kinds of behaviors. Now, we're still working through defining all of these issues. So let's go on and look at some enabling behaviors. And now we're really hitting where the rubber meets the road. We're walking this into the real world. What does this look like in actual behaviors? So when we talk about enabling behaviors, we're really talking about what are the actions or responses that inadvertently support or facilitate the continuation of these maladaptive behaviors, particularly in this context of substance abuse. Now, enablers often shield individuals from facing consequences for their actions. They protect them from the problem that they actually have. And by protecting them from the problem and not helping them to have a problem, they're actually perpetuating this cycle of addiction and preventing them from recognizing the need for change. One of the things that we do oftentimes is deny or minimize. It's not that bad. The problem's not that bad. We rationalize it. We excuse their behavior. Oh, it's just the way they are. So, for example, they might attribute an individual's erratic behavior to stress or temporary changes rather than acknowledging the underlying substance abuse issue. And maybe that the substance abuse issue has resulted in like water brain or damage to the frontal lobe where there's less control for the person. So they are being erratic, not because of stress or temporary challenges, because they're profoundly damaged because of their substance abuse. There's covering up and making excuses, where a partner might conceal the consequences of substance abuse to others. They might make excuses for missed commitments or their erratic behavior or their legal problems. And they shield them from the full impact by paying fines, by bailing them out, that sort of thing. And that ties directly into the financial support, giving person loans or bailing them out when they're struggling with substance abuse, enabling them continue their addictive behavior without experiencing the natural consequences of their actions. So this financial support can inadvertently perpetuate the person's dependency and undermine their motivation to seek help. Might want to rescue or caretake. So this is where there's a crisis or difficult situations resulting from substance abuse. So this might be well-intentioned, but rescuing somebody who really ends up reinforcing the individual's dependence on others and prevents them from taking responsibility for their actions. Now, if a person, is desperate and in need and it's clear and they're asking for help, great. Work with them in small ways to make the steps, but don't let yourself get sucked in and be emotionally invested where you need them to succeed. Emotionally, you should be doing the work, but not being so emotionally invested in it that you start harming yourself. Because there can also be enabling of manipulative behavior. So the enabler may inadvertently reinforce maladaptive tactics employed by this individual, where they try to justify or maintain their substance abuse. So, for example, they may give the person that's helping may give into emotional blackmail or threats or pleas for sympathy, reinforcing the individual's belief that their behavior is justified or acceptable. So one of the important things in working with families is not just to work with the person with the substance use disorder, but to work with the whole family, because the whole family needs to recognize that they have things that they need to work on, that they need to be able to protect themselves against. It's also important to look at what is motivating me to help this person. Love is a great thing, but when other things get mixed in with it, it can become a very confusing and harmful thing. So, when you're motivated by a desire to avoid conflict in order to maintain harmony, you are diving into that realm of codependency. Because enablers may fear confrontation. They may fear backlash from the individual. They may fear, oh no, the person's going to get afraid, so I'll just do what I need to do to keep short-term peace, rather than working through some of those things for long-term recovery. There might be where the enabler harbors deep-seated fears of rejection or abandonment. And this drives them to engage in behaviors aimed at appeasing the individual with a substance use disorder. They may worry about setting boundaries or withdrawing support will result in the loss of the relationship. And this might lead to them enabling the person's self-destructive behavior out of a sense of self-preservation. The enabler might often feel guilt or shame, and they might believe themselves to be partially responsible for the situation, and they may engage in enabling behaviors as a means of atoning for perceived past failures or shortcomings. And enablers may hold misguided beliefs about the nature of help and support, and they may equate enabling behaviors with genuine acts of kindness and compassion. They may believe that providing assistance or covering up the consequences of the individual's substance abuse is a demonstration of love and loyalty, and where they're failing to recognize that this is really a detrimental impact that they are having by their own actions on that person's long-term well-being. And the whole codependent relationship gets caught within the person, where there are unhealthy patterns of dependency and control, where the enabler may derive really their sense of identity and purpose from their role as caregivers. That they might find validation and self-worth in being able to rescue or fix the individual, or to be the hero in the other person's story. When really, life isn't about being a hero. It's simply about showing up. It's about caring for yourself, being reasonably caring to others, but there isn't a need to be a hero. Everyone has their own responsibilities. And by shielding individuals from the natural consequences of their action, we end up enabling behaviors that undermine their motivation to seek help, to confront their addiction, to take responsibility for their own journey. So within the family, there needs to be a sense of understanding these motivations. That these enabling behaviors actually contribute to the feelings of powerlessness and low self-esteem that they experience. That they are actually reinforcing negative beliefs about their ability to change and recover. That is, of the person that has the actual substance abuse problem. So there's a lot that needs to go on within working with a family with substance use disorders. And codependency is just one small part, but as you can see, it's a very complex part that we need to become experts in and take time to work through. Now, codependent individuals often find themselves in relationships with individuals struggling with these substance use disorders. They tend to draw themselves to each other. They tend to be drawn to these relationships because there's a sense of familiarity. There's a desire to help, an unconscious need to fulfill their own emotional needs through caregiving and control. But codependency within these relationships leads to a pattern of enabling behavior and emotional entanglement and disproportionate focus on the needs of the individual with the substance use disorder. And a person that is the enabler here finds themselves serving as a maladaptive coping pattern. And they do this by engaging in enabling behaviors where the codependent individual seeks to alleviate their own anxiety, their own guilt, their own fear of abandonment, often at the expense of perpetuating the individual's substance abuse disorder. So rather than helping the person overcome the substance abuse disorder, they actually need the person to continue in it because that is how they, as the codependent person, function. That whole need for temporary control and validation ends up reinforcing this pattern. There's also the whole issue of the power and control dynamics. The codependent and substance users' relationships are pretty much always characterized by an imbalanced power dynamic, where the codependent individual assuming a caretaker role and the substance user exerting control through manipulation, through coercion, or dependency. And this whole imbalance of power reinforces feelings of dependency and inadequacy within the codependent individual. And this perpetuates a cycle of dysfunction and emotional turmoil. So there's this intersection of codependency and substance use disorders that has really profound implications for the well-being of a family that's struggling with the dynamics of the relationship in this substance use disorder setting. Codependent individuals will experience high levels of stress, anxiety, emotional and physical exhaustion, financial exhaustion. They'll try to be navigating challenges of support by supporting their loved ones. And there's a lot that goes on with that. Now, I want to explore a little bit of enabling and maladaptive coping mechanisms, because this enabling behavior really serves as a coping mechanism for codependent individuals attempting to navigate the complexities of the relationship. These behaviors really provide a temporary sense of relief. So there's this feeling of guilt or anxiety, this emotional distress, and being able to immerse yourself in the other person takes that away for a little while. So we're kind of using, a codependent person is kind of using the other person's dysfunction as a drug to alleviate their own pain. The caretaking becomes a drug. It makes them feel better. And then when you have that power dynamic shift and that manipulation and dependence and emotional coercion, that's going to reinforce the anxiety within the codependent person. They're going to feel like they've lost their sense of autonomy and agency because they're always trying to appease the substance user. So you can see here how this relationship impacts the whole dynamic of the family. And so breaking the cycle is essential for the family, but it's not easy. But by breaking the cycle of enabling and power dynamics within this codependent substance user relationship, you really kind of need to look at all the multifaceted areas of it. What are the psychological factors? What are the communication patterns? What are the relational dynamics? Mapping all of that out so that everyone can see So interventions focused on enhancing self-awareness is essential, as well as helping people to set healthy boundaries. This is my stuff. This is your stuff. You deal with your stuff. I'll deal with my stuff. You can't have say over my stuff, and I won't have say over your stuff. But you better show up and be responsible for the stuff that we share. That is a way of being effective in coping strategies, of empowering that codependent individual to reclaim their autonomy and assert their needs within the relationship. Now, of course, there needs to be aims at supporting substance users, but it's in supporting the substance user in recognizing the impact of their behavior and taking responsibility for their actions is really essential for fostering meaningful change. Doesn't mean being mean to them, but being real to them. We could call this carefrontation. Not confrontation, but being authentic and real about the harms that are being done. And reminding them of that and getting them to repeat that back so that they, too, can take ownership of it. So when thinking in terms of the underlying psychological mechanisms that drive and sustain codependent relationships, we need to also think in terms of what are the cognitive aspects of that? What are the emotional patterns of that? So codependent individuals will often exhibit what we call cognitive distortions and emotional patterns that contribute to the maintenance of these dysfunctional relationships. So they may have voices in their head that say, I am unworthy, or I need to be perfect in order to be loved, or I have a heightened sense of responsibility for the well-being of others. And these cognitive distortions end up being very absolute kind of thinking where, it's either all bad or it's all good. There is no gray. When life is nothing but gray. It's about black and white thinking or catastrophizing. Oh, the worst is going to happen. Or all of this feelings of anxiety and distress ends up twisting the thinking. The anxious, ambivalent attachment styles that are characterized by a fear of abandonment and a preoccupation with seeking assurance and closeness in a relationship is also something that is so harmful. A person to be in a healthy relationship needs to have a secure attachment, one that knows that there's commitment, but there's also independence. It's wonderful when the person's there, but you're okay without them being there. That is where a healthy relationship is. Whereas the codependent relationship is that insecure, anxious kind of or ambivalent attachment, where it's either stay away or oh, I need you. And then, of course, the dysregulation that comes in codependent relationships. If there's constant fighting and making up and blow-ups and then short periods of calm, that's a clear sign that you're in a codependent relationship. Codependent individuals will often struggle with regulating their own emotions autonomously. They're going to seek validation and reassurance from others to alleviate their anxiety, their insecurity, their self-doubt. And that leads to this perpetual cycle of emotional dysregulation. And when you grow up in that kind of environment, of course you are going to be living a very difficult life and have difficulty forming healthy, secure attachments of your own. So it's important not just for the partner of the person with substance abuse problems to deal with this, but for the children as well, or the grandchildren, because they're all going to be affected by this pattern. So, I want you to just take a little bit of time here, and we're just going to do a little bit of a practice. And what I want you to do is, this is just a little tool I want you to do, and I want you to grab a piece of paper and have four letters at the top of the page. There'll be an E, then there'll be a C, then there'll be an H, and then there'll be an S. So put that across the top of the page. Okay, now I am going to just read some statements, and if the statement is true for you, then just give yourself a check mark under the E. Okay, and then we'll count up how many check marks you have under the E. So under the E scale, if this is true for you, I often feel responsible for fixing other people's problems. If that's true for you, give yourself a check mark. If not, don't worry about it. I make excuses for someone else's behavior, even when it is harmful. I will do whatever it takes to avoid conflict, even if it means covering up bad behavior. I believe it's my duty to keep things running smoothly, even if that means ignoring serious issues. I often protect others from the consequences of their actions. Okay, that's your E scale. So I want you to count up how many check marks you have there, and you rate that total, maybe above the E. So you have your total for E. Then we go to the C, which is the next letter, and put check marks under this one if they're true for you. And just, don't think too deeply about it. Just, think, is this true for me? Yeah, okay, then I'll do it. I feel a strong need to be needed by others. I often prioritize others' needs over my own to an unhealthy extent. I struggle to say no, even when it's inconvenient or harmful to me. My mood is heavily dependent on the emotional state of someone close to me. I feel anxious or distressed when I am not helping someone else. Okay, add those up. And that's your score for C, so put that above C. Then H, the H scale. I feel responsible for setting a good example for everyone around me. Second one, I try to hide my own problems or feelings to maintain an image of strength. Third one, I often take on more responsibility than I should to keep everything under control. Next one, I feel that I must succeed in order to make up for the problems in my family. And the last one, I am seen as the one who keeps it together when things fall apart. So add up that, all your check marks there, that is your H score. And then finally the S, your S score. I often feel blamed for problems that aren't my fault. I tend to act out or rebel when I feel misunderstood or unfairly treated. I am frequently characterized or punished more harshly than others in my family. I feel like no matter what I do, I'm labeled as the troublemaker. I sometimes take on the role of being the problem just to deflect attention from others. Okay, add those up. That is your S score. Now, I want you to write beside these letters now. E stands for enabler. C stands for codependent. H stands for hero. And S stands for scapegoat. So, as a general rule, you could say that if you have a score of 3 or higher on any of those, you're probably taking those on as part of your role within your family situation. Just a little bit of self-awareness for yourself. Codependent families often exhibit very distinct roles that members unconsciously adopt to maintain the dysfunctional equilibrium of the system within their family. So we have the enabler, who is the caretaker, the protector. They shield others from consequences. There's the codependent individual that derives their sense of identity and self-worth from caregiving and meeting the needs of others, often at their own expense and the expense of their own well-being. There's the substance user that struggles with the addiction or the substance use, and they tend to serve as the focal point when we're dealing with counseling within families, because that's why they come in. But there's also the hero role, that one that's the high-achieving family member that seeks to maintain this facade of normalcy and success, and they try to compensate for the underlying dysfunction within the family, rather than trying to work at healing the family. And then there's the scapegoat, the one that rebels against the family norms and expectations and draws attention away from the underlying issues of the family systems. Now, here's part of the tragedy here, is that codependency and all of these roles end up being transmitted across generations, from one family to the next, through learned behavior, through coping mechanisms and communication patterns. And children raised in codependent families learn to adapt to dysfunctional dynamics. They internalize the false beliefs and the behaviors that perpetuate codependency into adulthood. And then they carry it on again. So growing up in a codependent family environment can have profound implications for not only the couple, but for the children, for shaping their beliefs, their rational, basic ideas of what is just in the world, of their relationships, of their self-worth, of emotional regulation. And they're going to struggle then with healthy boundaries and have experienced difficulties forming secure attachments. And of course, codependent families are often characterized by the underlying traumas that go along with all of this: abuse, neglect, loss. And trauma exacerbates codependent dynamics and fuels patterns of enmeshment and control and emotional volatility. So, hope you see there that it is important to have boundaries and self-care, and to help the family members grow in learning boundaries, because boundaries are really essential for defining healthy limits, for asserting individual autonomy and protecting emotional well-being within relationships. In codependent relationships, people often struggle to maintain boundaries due to fears of rejection and guilt and a desire to maintain harmony. But when you set clear and assertive boundaries, it fosters mutual respect, promotes self-care, and creates a space for authentic connection and growth. Now, the best boundaries are ones that are strong, but also flexible and somewhat permeable. You don't want a solid wall. You can't have relationships through a solid wall, but you also can't have relationships when there are no boundaries at all. You just mesh into the other person, and then there's just one person. And that's not a relationship. That's one person. So having effective boundary setting is essential in relationships and in families. But it requires self-awareness. It requires assertiveness and a willingness to prioritize one's own needs and values. And that's part of raising children too. A child, to be healthy, needs to have assertiveness. You can't crush assertiveness within a child. Without assertiveness, they will not take care of their own needs. They need that, and parents need to recognize that. We all need to work together as individuals to have self-awareness and assertiveness and a willingness to engage with each other. And so there needs to be clear communication about personal needs and values and boundaries. If you have never had a conversation about your own personal needs and your own personal boundaries and your own values with others, that's not really a family. That's a bunch of people living together and manipulating each other. Another thing to do is it's important to communicate with each other. And one of the best ways to communicate with others is to use I statements, not you statements. An I statement says, I would like this. A you statement is more destructive. It is, you always do that, or you must do that. That's controlling somebody else or making a value judgment of somebody else. All you really have control over is yourself. So you can say, I would like, I would wish for. You are expressing something, and then it's up to the other person to respond to that. But it's important to also be consistent in enforcing these boundaries and to follow through with consequences when they're crossed. People need to understand that boundaries need to be respected. And we should also seek support, because it's not easy changing. So it's important to have trusted friends, have trusted family members, have trusted therapists to reinforce the boundary setting that goes on. And in the midst of that, to have self-care. Change is not easy. It is exhausting. We lie to ourselves because change is hard. We need to have ways to replenish our emotional reserves, to reduce our stress, ways that are healthy and promote overall well-being. Things like practicing relaxation techniques, going for a walk, engage in activities that bring joy and fulfillment and a sense of purpose, like a hobby, spending time in nature, doing a creative pursuit, things that reveal meaning in life. It's important to prioritize physical health because our brains and our bodies are physical. There needs to be regular exercise, nutritious eating habits, adequate rest and sleep. Without those things, the spirit withers and dies. There's no way around it. And also seeking professional support through therapy, group therapy, support groups, counseling. All of that becomes important in this process. So I hope that you learn something within this class. And I'm going to go back and just review some of the three main themes for this class. First off, what is codependency? That is a dysfunctional relationship pattern where individuals prioritize the needs of others over their own. And often this has detrimental effects on their own well-being and their own financial situation. Codependent relationships and codependent individuals may have an excessive reliance on others for validation and may engage in this enabling behavior to perpetuate, that really ends up perpetuating the dysfunctional dynamics that support the substance use disorder. So it's important to be aware of that. And when we talk about enabling behaviors, those are the actions and responses that inadvertently have unintended consequences of supporting or facilitating the continued maladaptive behaviors that are particular to the context of substance use and addiction. And finally, boundaries. Remember, boundaries are limits, they're guidelines that help individuals establish and protect themselves, their physical space, their emotional space, their psychological well-being within the relationships. Without healthy boundaries, there cannot be healthy relationships. So healthy boundaries are those that are flexible, are assertive, where you are communicating your needs, your values, and your limits, and respecting the boundaries of others. And we close out with a little sample question here. What would be the best way to describe codependency? And I would suggest here that it would be C, enabling behaviors that perpetuate dysfunctional dynamics. Because codependency involves engaging in enabling behaviors that do inadvertently support to perpetuate dysfunctional patterns within the relationships. And this is particularly true within the context of substance use within the family. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.